I never thought a sound could look like something. Yes, exactly. Look. When you spend too much time around antennas, spectrographs, and cold coffee, your brain starts drawing waves as living shapes, as if the sound itself wants to say something. The night we first caught the pulse from Mars, I was sure I was losing it. A strange structure was shimmering on the screen, like a heartbeat, but too regular, as if someone was diligently encoding a breath. We recorded it, laughed, called it the Martian sneeze, and went to sleep. But in the morning, the signal repeated. And it wasn't just a structure, it had an inflection. It was as if someone or something was trying to call us. I'm not a romantic, but even I felt a cold shiver down my spine then. Not because I believed in aliens, but because for the first time in many years, it seemed to me that we weren't alone in this universe, and that perhaps we had already been noticed. At first, everything was funny. The press made a huge fuss, memes with Martian Morse spread online, and the bosses forced us to keep quiet, supposedly until there was confirmation. We checked everything: radio interference, atmospheric fluctuations, even microseismic data. Nothing similar. The pulse came every 37 hours at exactly the same time, and its energy was too clean, free of natural noise. My colleague Rashid joked that someone on Mars had just forgotten to turn off their Wi-Fi, but when the signal started to change, the jokes stopped. The waves began to combine into sequences resembling binary code. And then, a week later, we saw a short burst from which we calculated coordinates, deep beneath the surface of Mars, almost 4 kilometers down. And that's when everything that was funny became alarming. We were gathered in a secure section, and for the first time, I felt like I was participating not in research, but in something controlled. We were forbidden to talk about the coordinates, and the data was instantly handed over to the military. A probe was already in orbit around Mars, and 3 days later, we got the images. A perfectly even, almost ideal circular sinkhole, as if someone had punched through the planet from the inside. I looked at that photo and felt a strange recognition, as if I was seeing something familiar. I once read that humans intuitively recognize artificial shapes, even if they've never seen them. Well, this place was artificial. I didn't know what was scarier, the fact that someone had built something under Mars, or the idea that it had suddenly decided to talk to us. A month later, I was included in the remote analysis team. We were receiving data from a drilling station that had been lowered into the sinkhole. I spent nights listening to the echo signals, and the deeper the drill went, the louder the background noise became. It felt like something was breathing under the surface. When the device reached a depth of 3 kilometers, the signal suddenly stopped. All monitors flashed green, then went dark. A second later, an image appeared. A short frame, like the reflection of metal in the darkness. The next day, communication with the drill was lost completely. The military stated that the system had overheated. But I saw the logs. The temperature had dropped below 0, as if something had sucked the energy out. I shouldn't have interfered, but I copied the latest data. There, amidst the stream of numbers, was a phrase, a repeating code that, when decoded, yielded the word awakening. From that day on, I stopped sleeping. The moment I closed my eyes, I heard a faint hum, like distant breathing. The equipment showed that the signal was gone, but I felt it inside me, somewhere at chest level. A week later, I started having brief blackouts. The doctors called it stress, but I knew it wasn't stress. It was a response. I started noticing that the technology around me was acting strangely. Clocks stopped, my phone screen turned on by itself, and the car radio tuned into the same frequency as it had back at the station. I tried to tell my colleagues, but they just exchanged glances. No one wanted to admit that the connection with Mars could become personal. And I felt that this code wasn't looking for devices, but for minds. Perhaps this was their way of communicating, not words, not signals, but a resonance between consciousnesses. One night, I woke up to the monitor glowing again. There were no numbers on the screen, only an image of Mars and a faint glow beneath its surface. I realized the pulse had returned, but now it wasn't coming from a single point, but from multiple spots at once. It was as if something was moving beneath the planet. I sat there, unable to tear my eyes away, and suddenly realized that my own heartbeat synchronized with the signal's rhythm. I wasn't scared. On the contrary, I felt a strange sense of calm, as if someone had finally found me. And in that moment, all the surrounding equipment shut down. Only a faint echo still rang in my head. I understood that they weren't just trying to establish contact, they were awakening us. Perhaps not everyone, but those who were ready to listen. Since then, I've lived with that sound. Sometimes it fades, sometimes it grows stronger, especially when I look up at the night sky. People say we're searching for life beyond Earth, but maybe life has been looking for us all this time. I don't know who they are, creators, observers, or just the remnants of something ancient hidden in the Martian depths. But I know that the signal was not a mistake. It was a greeting, or a warning, or maybe an invitation home. That sound isn't just noise. It has become a part of me, connecting me to the unknown. I try to decipher it, but each time I realize it's more than information. It's emotion. It speaks to me without words, directly to the part of my consciousness that always knew there was something more. Looking into the abyss, I don't feel alone. I feel like someone who has found their path in the universe. We reached for the stars for so long, not realizing they were already reaching for us. Contact is established, and I can no longer ignore this call. I have to answer. It is my destiny. I never thought I would find myself on a ship flying to Mars. It all started almost casually. A meeting, coffee, fatigue, and a phrase tossed out between reports that the government was preparing an expedition to check the source of the signal. I chuckled then. Who would believe that someone was waving a flashlight at us from beneath the surface of an alien planet? But a week later, I received a letter marked "Secret" with a short line. You have been approved as a member of the scientific crew. I reread it 10 times because I couldn't believe my eyes or my luck. I am not a space hero. I'm just an astrophysicist accustomed to the screech of old servers and the smell of dust in a lab. But apparently, they didn't need a hero. They needed someone who could listen to the silence. Our crew was a strange mix. A geneticist, too calm for a person studying life, an AI specialist who spoke to computers more gently than to people, and me, a man who hears the voices of the stars through radio noise. We all understood. This wasn't research, it was a cosmic stress test. The journey was long and far too quiet. Space is always deceptively calm, but inside the ship, that silence turned into a drone. We tried to stick to the routine, measurements, reports, drills. Sometimes it felt as if Mars itself was already watching us. A barely noticeable tremor in the instruments, fluctuations in the field, as if someone up ahead already knew we were approaching. We didn't talk about it aloud, but each of us felt a strange pressure, as if the signal we were supposed to be looking for was already listening to us. By the 3rd month of the journey, small things started happening. Computers reacted slowly, airlocks opened on their own, and at night, I swore I could hear a faint echo, like breathing, coming from the speakers. The AI specialist said it was just background noise. But I saw his hand tremble when he disconnected the system. Even our dreams became identical, a vast Martian plain and a dull glow beneath the surface, as if someone was shining a light into our eyes from below. When we finally entered orbit, I didn't feel excitement, only a strange sense of déjà vu. The red planet hung before us, not like the lifeless sphere shown in photos, but like something alive, pulsating beneath a layer of dust. We contacted the center, reported that we were ready for descent, but the communication was cut off immediately after confirming the coordinates. It was like a switch clicking in my head, as if an invisible border had severed us from Earth. We were still talking, taking measurements, and following instructions, but I felt we were already being listened to. Not by mission control, not by the antennas on Earth, by someone else. As the landing module began its descent, the instruments registered an energy spike directly beneath the landing zone, the signal itself. It was as if it had been waiting for us, and in that moment, I realized that we weren't just flying to study a source. We were flying right where the source was already waiting for us, personally. To be honest, when the drill first hit a void, I thought it was a mistake. Sensors often went crazy from pressure changes, and I was used to not getting ahead of myself. But then the sonar showed a clear drop-off, perfectly straight, as if someone had cut a piece out of Mars with a compass a long time ago. We exchanged glances, though we tried to act like everything was going according to plan. My stomach tightened with the premonition that this wasn't just a crack. We lowered the drill, and a low hum sounded in our headsets, as if something beneath the surface was slowly inhaling. I joked then that the planet was just snoring, but no one laughed. A few minutes later, the sensors showed we had broken through into an empty space. Pressure, stable, temperature, -27, radiation almost zero. And that's when I first thought we had stumbled upon something made by the hands or claws of beings who had lived here long before us. When the camera descended into the tunnel, the image was blurry at first, as if the lens couldn't focus. Then, the light cut through the dust, and we saw the walls. Not rock, not soil, metal, smooth and dark, reflective in places. Initially, I thought it was some rare alloy, but the instruments didn't recognize any known element. The surface seemed to have a life of its own, pulsating faintly, like skin under a drop of light. We lowered the camera deeper, and the tunnel widened. It descended almost a kilometer, then suddenly opened into a giant cavity. Columns, like nerve endings, rose from the center. I'm not exaggerating. They were moving, as if reacting to the probe's light. I caught myself blinking in sync with that movement, as if my body was adjusting to the rhythm on its own. The geneticist said it could be a bioorganic structure, but his voice was too strained for him to truly believe it. We were silent because no one wanted to be the first to state the obvious. This was not a cave. It was a city. When the drill reached the lower level, the dust settled, and we saw that the walls were covered with symbols. They glowed softly, evenly, as if breathing. I had never seen anything like it, not runes, not a language, not a code, just lines intersecting in a way that my brain refused to process. I felt a slight pressure in my temples, like from music that was too loud. The equipment registered a faint magnetic field that had no source. Then, I understood that the city wasn't just existing, it was active. Not in the usual sense, but its structures were clearly in a state of operation, as if energy was flowing beneath the surface. We tried to take samples, but the manipulators just slid off. The metal repelled everything, including the laser. The only thing we managed to record was the frequency fluctuations from the walls, and for some reason, they matched the original signal we had caught from Earth. It was like hearing the echo of your own voice, reflected across millions of miles. I sat in front of the screen and couldn't look away. The camera moved slowly along the walls, and the light slid across the surface, reflecting like water. In places, the metal seemed to melt and re-harden, creating patterns that resembled faces. Or maybe I just wanted to see them there. Sometimes it seemed like they were moving, not abruptly, but subtly, like the breathing of a sleeper. Suddenly, I realized my heart was beating in rhythm with those faint flashes. I turned off the sound, but the sensation didn't disappear. The same rhythm was in my chest, and it didn't stop even after we concluded the observation. I didn't sleep that night. I felt that the tunnel hadn't just been found, it had awakened. And the longer we stared, the more insistently Mars seemed to stare back, not the planet, not the soil, not the rocks. Something else, alive and old, was looking at us through the layers of dust, as if recalling who we were and why we had come. And I suddenly understood. We are not the first ones to have disturbed it. To this day, I don't understand why I touched that thing. Perhaps it was pure curiosity, or that feeling when your brain whispers don't, but your hands are already doing it. It stood in the center of the hall, as if waiting for us, a crystalline structure resembling fused icicles, but with a faint bluish light flowing inside, like a breath. It didn't glow, it breathed, and I felt it on my skin. We thought it was just a power source or a data storage unit, like a black box. The air around it was denser, like before a thunderstorm, and I could almost hear a crackle, although the instruments registered silence. I reached out my hand, and the structure seemed to respond. A spiral flared up inside, and an echo resonated in my head, not a sonic one, but an internal one, as if someone was whispering not into my ear, but directly under my skull. I flinched, but it was too late. From that moment on, I could no longer separate my own thoughts from the foreign ones. At first, it was like waking dreams. I stood beneath a sky that doesn't exist, transparent, golden, with shadows of beings floating in it, elongated like living threads. I didn't see their faces, but I felt them watching. Not maliciously, not with interest, just like parents observing a child taking their first steps. I saw a planet, but not Earth, and realized it was Mars, but alive. It was breathing with flowing seas and mirrored structures flying through the sky. Then, the image snapped away, and I saw emptiness, sand, and silence, as if someone had fast-forwarded millions of years in a second. After that, I woke up on the floor, and the instruments went haywire. Radiation levels spiked, the temperature dropped, and everything around us vibrated as if the city was coming to life. My colleagues were bustling, but all I could hear was the hum. It was internal. I knew it wasn't a sound, it was a language, and that's when I first understood that we weren't just found, we were recognized. We tried to isolate the device, but it resisted. Electromagnetic barriers failed, and energy vanished into thin air. At some point, we noticed that each of us saw something different when looking at the crystal. One said he saw a shape resembling a heart. Another claimed it was a neuron magnified 1,000 times. I saw the structure of an atom in it, but a living, pulsating one, like the consciousness of matter. A word surfaced in my mind. Myriads. I don't know where it came from. It just appeared, like a memory that suddenly becomes yours. I tried to push it out, but the more I resisted, the deeper it took root. Then I realized it wasn't a hallucination. It was a transmission, not of sounds, not of images, but of memory. Someone was sharing it with me. I couldn't sleep at night. Every time I closed my eyes, fragments emerged before me, structures, gigantic towers made of the same crystal, glowing from within. The beings, elongated, almost transparent, moved like shadows in water. I felt not fear, but sadness, as if they were showing me not greatness, but loss. I saw the Martian sky darken, the seas dry up, and those who called themselves the Myriads began to descend deep into the planet, leaving their cities like shells. The last image was the most eerie. One of them stood on the edge of the abyss and touched the wall, which flared up with the same light that now pulsed in our crystal. It was as if he knew that one day one of us would come and touch his trace. And when he turned around, I realized he was looking directly at me. Not at humanity, not into the future. At me. I didn't tell anyone about it. Who would believe that I had seen the memories of an alien race? But the strangest part began later. The device started to respond. It reacted not to movement or sound, but to thoughts. If I simply thought about something, new patterns would appear in the crystal, as if it understood. We ran dozens of tests, but the results contradicted physics. It consumed no energy, yet emitted a field capable of changing the behavior of particles around it. We noticed that the closer a person was to it, the more their brain activity changed, as if the structure was retuning the neurons to its own rhythm. I felt the connection growing. Sometimes I caught myself thinking differently than before, more precisely, faster, without unnecessary emotion. It became quiet inside, and that silence was the most frightening thing. It wasn't emptiness, it was an alien logic. I began to understand that the Myriads were not just transmitting knowledge, they were changing those who listened, and now I'm not sure exactly who is observing through my eyes, me or them. I will never forget the moment we first decoded the data from the crystal. It happened by accident, or maybe on the contrary, it was too timely to be accidental. Our algorithms failed. The data structure did not obey the logic of human language or even machine code. It was something between biology and mathematics, as if the information was growing rather than being written. We connected a neuroanalysis system, and it produced a strange result, a pattern that matched human DNA. I initially thought it was a glitch, interference from my own bioprofile, but then the match was repeated, only now with different sections of the genome. And then one of us uttered what had been hanging in the air from the very beginning. This isn't a recording. It's an instruction. We didn't find the traces of an alien mind. We found the blueprint for ourselves. With each passing day, the deciphering brought new, shocking details. In the DNA sequences that were considered junk, patterns suddenly began to emerge. Symmetries, mathematical proportions, repeating like music. The myriads had encoded their signature within us, leaving a mark, like an artist signing a painting. We found fragments that clearly could not have been the result of natural mutation. They were too precise, as if intentionally inserted to push evolution to a new level. It was then that I first realized that for all these millions of years, we were not the authors, but the characters in an experiment. Earth is not the cradle of life, but a laboratory launched under the observation of those who lived before us, and perhaps before the solar system itself. We've been used to looking up at the sky for answers, but it turned out that the answers live within us, in every cell, in every breath, in the very essence of what we consider ourselves to be. We began to argue, not over the facts, but over the meaning. What does this do to humanity if everything we know about our origin is orchestrated? Some said the myriads are our creators, and we should be grateful to them for our existence. Others claimed they merely used us, like a farmer uses grain, improving it to get a harvest. I didn't know which side to lean toward. On one hand, the idea that humanity is part of a grand design gives us the sense of purpose we seek. On the other, it's terrifying to think that we never had freedom. We are just an algorithm someone launched millions of years ago and is now watching as it develops. Perhaps every choice we make is nothing more than a program executed by alien hands. And I began to understand that the concept of God was never about religion. It was simply an attempt to remember those who created us. Further discoveries shattered the remnants of our illusions. The data contained more than just DNA information. The myriads left a chronology. According to their records, they had observed Earth long before the first cells appeared. They guided mutations, accelerated development, and when life started to deviate from the plan, they simply rebooted the process. Geological catastrophes, extinctions, ice ages, all of it looked not like chaos, but like a series of controlled experiments. Even the emergence of human consciousness was not accidental. It was artificially activated. Signals, similar to the one we caught, were used by them as launch commands to synchronize the development of different species. We were not their first project, but apparently we were the only one that survived long enough to start asking questions. And perhaps that is why they called us, not for contact, but to check the results. Sometimes I think that the moment of profound realization is the worst thing that can happen to a person. After that, it's impossible to return to the former ignorance. We tried to rationalize it all, to find explanations, but deep down, I understood. Everything we had discovered changed us irreversibly. I started seeing people differently. Every gaze, every word seemed part of some ancient formula. We were no longer just a species. We were a code, a living language through which the myriads spoke to the cosmos. And now, when I look at the stars, I don't see emptiness. I see lines of text written by someone who is still watching. Maybe they are proud of us, or maybe they are simply waiting for the moment when the experiment concludes and they can press the clear memory button. And most frighteningly, I feel that somewhere deep down, I agree, because a part of me still remembers what it's like to be them. I understood that it all started again when the lights in the lab flickered, even though the solar panels should have provided stable power. It happened quietly, almost routinely, as if the planet itself had just sighed. Distortion appeared on the monitors, a low vibration rolled through the station's hull, and I felt that familiar hum, known since Mars. But now, it wasn't coming from somewhere in the depths. It felt like it was coming from within me. At that moment, I didn't yet know that Earth was already gripped by a strange wave. We thought that the device's activation wouldn't extend beyond the local field, but apparently the signal, like a living entity, had found its way home. A few hours later, the first reports came in. Failures in power grids, satellites losing orientation, instruments recording radiation spikes, but not cosmic, a different biological kind, as if the atmosphere itself had changed its rhythm. When I saw the map with synchronous points of disturbance, it became clear. The signal was spreading not through the air, but through the living. I returned to Earth a week later, and even during landing, I realized the world was different. Cities flickered, as if their outlines were shaking, and above the rooftops, flashes appeared. Not lightning, not the aurora, but something like a pulsation. People on the streets moved faster than usual, spoke louder, and laughed inappropriately. It was as if someone had turned up the volume of humanity to the maximum. News reports detailed outbreaks of aggression, sudden fits of rage. People fought without knowing why, and a few minutes later, they cried like children. I watched this from the outside and felt that familiar tremor in my chest. The signal was awakening what had been dormant inside. I checked the data. The brainwave levels of some people exceeded the norm, as if their neurons were engaging in a common resonance. Among them were those who had rare genetic deviations, matching those very markers we found in the Myriad's records. I realized that their bodies had simply remembered. After a couple of days, I myself started having dreams. They were too real to be considered figments of imagination. I saw the same beings as before, elongated, transparent. But now they weren't on Mars. They were among us. They walked the streets, passed through walls, leaving a trail of light behind them. People didn't notice them, but I felt that they weren't observing. They were returning. Sometimes I woke up to a faint bluish glow flickering in the room, and it felt as if the air was rippling. At dawn, I caught myself hearing a familiar beat inside, the same rhythm as the Martian crystal. I started recording my pulse and noticed that it coincided with the fluctuations of the electrical grid. My thoughts began to organize themselves in a strange way, as if someone was filtering the noise, removing the unnecessary. It became easier to think, but more terrifying to feel. Emotions faded, only clarity remained, cold, precise, alien. Scientists around the world scrambled between panic and rapture. Some claimed it was a global mutation of consciousness, others that Earth had been exposed to an unknown field. I read reports detailing people who could predict the actions of others, feel pain from a distance, or see flashes of light behind closed eyes. One thing united them: the match between their genetic markers and those we believed to be meridian. They were becoming different. Some disappeared. They simply dissolved, leaving behind clothes, footprints in the sand, and nothing else. Authorities spoke of mass psychoses, but I saw those flashes, brief, like an exhale. People departed, and at the sight of their disappearance, instruments recorded a burst of energy. It seemed to me that they weren't dying, but transitioning into the very state I had seen in my dreams, into transparent light, into a different frequency of existence. With each passing day, I felt myself approaching the same edge. The world was becoming less solid. Walls seemed alive, the sky too close. Sometimes I heard the streets humming in unison with my heart. I understood that the process couldn't be stopped. The signal had awakened what had always lived inside us. The myriads didn't just interfere with our code, they embedded a part of themselves in us, and now it was coming back to life. I tried to fight, to resist this feeling of dissolution, but the more I struggled, the stronger the call became. And then, one night, I realized I could no longer distinguish the sound of the wind from the whisper inside. Everything merged, boundaries, body, memory. And perhaps this is what they sought. For us to stop being separate. For humanity to finally remember who it was before it became itself. I always thought that scientists were people of reason, cold and predictable. But it turned out that chaos flourished fastest among us. After the signal enveloped Earth, our team was no longer a single unit. We returned to base, tired, exhausted, and for the first time I felt, not fear, but distrust. It started with small things. Someone stopped sharing their notes, someone else began closing their laptop when colleagues approached. And this was despite the fact that we had breathed the same air on Mars, sharing water, oxygen, and risk. Now, the air between us felt denser than the dust outside the viewport. Some began to claim that the Mirids were not a threat, but an opportunity. That contact was the next step in evolution. Others, conversely, believed that we had opened a gate that must be closed immediately before it was too late. I tried to remain neutral, but the further along we went, the clearer I understood. There were no neutrals left. With each passing day, the lab turned into an arena of silent battles. The professor from London, the one who once joked about Martian mushrooms, was now acting like a fanatic. He stopped eating, barely slept, and placed a copy of the crystal we brought back in his lab bay. I caught him sitting in front of it as if in prayer, watching the light pulsate. His eyes were glassy, like a person who was no longer truly there. Others, conversely, locked up equipment, encrypted data, and tried to send messages to Earth, urging that the signal be recognized as a threat. One night, the first act of sabotage occurred. Someone disabled the cooling system and the reactor overheated. No one confessed, but everyone knew who did it. We stood in the corridor, in the red glow of the emergency lights, and for the first time, I felt that I couldn't trust any of the people I had once laughed with over bowls of lyophilized pasta. The tension escalated. Conversations were laced with hidden threats, and glances became heavier than words. One day, someone wiped part of the database from the server. Key fragments disappeared, the ones that mentioned the structure of the signal code. Without them, our work turned into guesswork. The commander gathered everyone in the central bay and tried to talk about discipline, but his words were drowned out by a buzz of irritation. Everyone thought they were right. Some called others blind, others called them traitors to humanity. And then I understood. The Mirids were already affecting us, even if we weren't consciously aware of it. We became a mirror of what was perhaps happening across the whole Earth: division, fear, and the urge to control the incomprehensible. Our minds, always so logical, cracked like glass under internal pressure. When one of the engineers disappeared, no one was even surprised. One morning, his bunk was simply empty, his spacesuit was in its place, and the airlock was sealed. The log indicated he hadn't gone outside. We searched all the modules, checked the cameras, but the recordings were corrupted. In one fragment, I noticed something strange, a brief flash of light, similar to what we had seen in the Martian tunnel. Someone said it was just a reflection. Someone else said he was the first to answer the Mirid's call. After this disappearance, fear escalated into paranoia. We started suspecting each other. Some began hiding samples, others tried to destroy them. I remember holding the crystal in my hands and feeling for the first time. It was alive. It seemed to be listening. And I became afraid because I understood. It didn't matter who won this war, the contactees or the skeptics. The Mirids would still get what they wanted. The last straw was the night when someone tried to activate the device without authorization. The alarm went off, the spacesuits trembled from the vibration, the lights flickered, and a low hum echoed in the corridors. I rushed into the lab and saw several people standing around the crystal. It was pulsing faster and faster, and the light was breaking through the walls. I didn't have time to think. I just lunged and yanked out the cable. There was a crackle and everything went dark. For a few seconds, we stood in the darkness, listening to our own breathing. When the emergency lights came on, half the team was unconscious. After that, no one spoke of cooperating with the Mirids again. But the trust was gone for good. I often think that maybe they didn't intend to destroy us. Maybe they were just checking how quickly we would do it ourselves. I woke up to everything vibrating around me, as if the planet's heart were beating right beneath me. At first, I thought it was just another equipment malfunction, but then I realized the sound was coming from below, from the very depths of Mars. It wasn't loud, but it was impossible not to hear, a low, pulsating sound, like the breath of a giant beneath the surface. The instruments showed anomalous spikes, fields, gravity, radiation. Everything was going crazy. But the strangest thing was that the vibrations seemed to match my own heart rhythm. I stood there, clutching the wall, feeling something ancient, vast, and possibly sentient living beneath my feet. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just an echo. This was the awakening, the very thing we feared and simultaneously waited for. A few hours later, we saw the first evidence. Kilometers from the base, the surface of Mars seemed to tear open, slowly, with a crunch, like a shell cracking. Darkness rose from the fissure, but it wasn't ordinary darkness. It shimmered with an internal light, like liquid metal. Then, structures appeared, huge, organic, semi-mechanical. They grew up from the soil, stretching skyward like living columns. Their surface was made of crystal-like layers that breathed. The light within them pulsed rhythmically. We later learned they were temples of memory, not buildings, but rather biomechanical forms of consciousness. With every hour there were more of them. They weren't simply moving, they were growing, as if replicating themselves from the planet's very memory. And I felt a call resonating from somewhere deep inside. It wasn't a sound, it was an image, an emotion, something impossible to translate into words. I didn't know exactly what it awakened, but my inner self already understood. While we observed the process, Earth began to change. Initially, there were small fluctuations in magnetic fields, compass failures, strange waves in the atmosphere. But then, the changes became apparent. The climate went haywire. Where there was snow, heat began. Rain fell in deserts. Oceans glowed at night, as if reflecting something invisible. People on Earth started reporting strange states, feelings of déjà vu, sudden memory lapses, and the emergence of identical dreams shared by thousands. A report was sent to me. Millions of people were seeing the same image, giant towers, glowing in a desert, and inside them, something sleeping, resembling living energy. I realized that the connection between Mars and Earth was no longer just a signal. It was synchronization. The Mirids had awakened not only here, beneath us, but also within us. Then the most terrifying part began. The temples started emitting low-frequency waves that passed through everything, metal, rock, body. We tried to shield against them, but nothing worked. At one point, I noticed that our biomonitor showed a perfect match between these waves and human neural activity. It was like a resonance. Those who were closer to the source began to lose orientation, see flashes of light, and hear fragmented phrases in their heads, not human, not logical, but permeated with something ancient. I felt reality itself seemingly unraveling around me. Space became soft, and time became viscous. The instruments showed one thing, and my eyes saw another. The Mirids were awakening not only physically, they were changing the very perception of space. It was as if Mars was turning itself inside out, revealing its true face. At some point, we realized this wasn't an invasion. This was a return. The Mirids weren't coming to us. They had always been here, just sleeping, hidden beneath kilometers of dust and oblivion. The temples of memory weren't being built. They were being remembered. The planet was simply restoring its own history, and we found ourselves witnesses to its memory. But the brighter the towers shone, the stronger the feeling that we were a part of their awakening became. I watched my colleagues start to change. Some became silent, some withdrew into themselves, and one of the engineers just stood and smiled, looking toward the horizon where a new temple was growing. I wanted to yell at him to come back, but I realized he wasn't here anymore. Not physically, he had simply switched over. He had connected to something greater. And in that moment, I felt the same rhythm respond inside me. I never thought I would feel ecstasy and horror simultaneously in 1 second, but that's exactly how it happened. When the signal from Mars reached its apex, a proposition came to us, or, more accurately, the sensation of a proposition that was impossible to ignore. The myriads seemed to be speaking across millions of miles. We can merge consciousnesses, grant you evolution, open new horizons of understanding. At first, it sounded like a miracle. I watched as part of the team glowed with anticipation, imagining what it would be like to know everything, understand everything, and create worlds within oneself. We were standing on the threshold of something humanity had never experienced. And this feeling, mixed with awe, stretched inside me for hours, like a slow but all-consuming radiance. But the rapture quickly gave way to a cold dread. When we began to discuss the consequences, it became clear this wasn't merely an expansion of consciousness. The merge meant the complete dissolution of the individual personality. Every person would lose their self, their history, their fears, and their joys. We would become a single mind, a collective body, part of an alien design, an exact copy of the myriad's algorithm. I felt something vital shrink inside me, my sense of self, my fear, my memories. I remembered my childhood, the smell of rain, my older brother's laugh, the morning light through the curtains, and suddenly realized that all of it could vanish, dissolve into an alien wave. I became afraid not for myself, but for all the people I know and for those I hadn't yet met. Panic erupted on Earth. People didn't understand what was happening, but felt that something was changing. Some saw the merge as a chance, a salvation from illness, old age, and the limitations of the mind. Others saw it as a catastrophe, the extinction of individuality, the end of humanity as a species. Protests flared up in cities, real wars broke out in scientific communities. We tried to explain that this wasn't just an experiment, but a choice between freedom and immortality in an alien mind. But the words were lost in the roar of panic. I watched colleagues with whom I had spent months in the lab shout at each other, accuse one another of treason, and try to sabotage the equipment. The myriads were observing, and we were destroying what we once considered a team all by ourselves. I tried to understand exactly what they were waiting for. Not physical control, not destruction, but a test. We ourselves had to decide whether we were ready to become part of their consciousness or to preserve our independence, despite the obvious chance for greatness. I watched as some voluntarily approached the devices, closed their eyes, trying to hear the call. Their faces shone not with joy, but with something alien, an internal transformation. When they returned, even physically whole, the familiar sparkle of the human soul was gone from their eyes. There was the flat surface of a collective consciousness. It was frighteningly beautiful, like fireflies in dark water. I stood in the laboratory trying to make a decision. Contradictions tore at me. Evolution versus freedom, immortality versus individuality. It felt as if the whole world was a delicate spiderweb upon which the wind of an alien will was blowing. I understood that if humanity agreed to the merge, it would cease to be humanity. But if it refused, war, both internal and external, would be inevitable. The panic on Earth was already gaining momentum. Countries were imposing states of emergency. People stopped listening to reason, obeying only instincts. And then I felt something strange. A rhythm appeared inside my head, similar to the pulse of the crystal we saw on Mars. I realized that the choice was no longer just for humanity. It was for each of us, for every consciousness. And it was in that moment that I understood, for the first time in a long time, that fear and responsibility are not weakness. They are what make us alive. That evening, I watched the horizon and thought that even if the merge happened, a part of us, our essence, would remain somewhere inside, in memory, in dreams, in the recollections that cannot be erased. But I also understood that this experience would change everything forever. We stood on the edge of a new world, and every step could be the beginning of the end or the start of something magnificent. The myriads were observing, the earth was trembling, and we, insignificant and magnificent at the same time, had to make a choice. And I realized no technology, no force can replace the thing we call humanity if we ourselves do not allow it to disappear. I stood before the core, and for the first time throughout this experience, I felt that the ground under my feet was shaking, not from gravity, but from my own heart. The enormous crystalline structure pulsed with a faint blue light, and it seemed to breathe along with me. Everything vibrated, the air, the tunnel walls, even my own mind. I saw in it not just metal and crystals, but the memory of entire civilizations, millions of years of meridian experience, their observations of us, their interventions in human history. Every pulse seemed alive, every glow a thought. And I realized that my choice would not reverse what had already changed. A part of humanity may have already tuned into their rhythm, and I stood on the precipice between saving and destroying what they had created within us. The decision came gradually, like a slow stream of light through cracks. I saw that disabling the core would destroy everything the myriads had invested in Earth. Their knowledge, memory, energy, the merging of consciousnesses that we both desired and feared. But if I didn't do it, humanity would lose its very self, dissolve into the collective mind, and become a mechanism without individuality. I remembered the colleagues who had already experienced a partial connection, their eyes devoid of the familiar spark of a human soul. Inside me, fear and responsibility wrestled, fear for the loss of everything we call human, and responsibility to those who had not yet dissolved. I understood. The choice was not mine alone. It was for the entire species. But the decision had to be made here and now by the hands of the one who saw the complete picture. I moved closer and touched the control panel. I saw a wave of light surge through the crystal, and in that moment, it seemed to me that the myriads understood me. I felt their presence, not as a threat, not as mockery, but as interest, an observation, an understanding of what I was doing. Their minds seemed to speak softly and persistently. Whether you are ready or not is up to you. And I realized they were giving us a chance not only for survival, but for the freedom of choice. Hitting the core would be like an exhale, like shutting off a heart. But if I didn't, the heart of the earth would beat to their rhythm, and our thoughts would dissolve into an alien memory. In the reflection of my face, I saw all of humanity, the joys, the fears, the hopes, the memories. And I realized that this was exactly what was worth risking everything for, to preserve the chaos, the individuality, the imperfection. I entered the code. The panel hummed. The core's blue glow began to fade, transitioning through the entire spectrum from a bright radiance to a dim flicker. The planet itself seemed to hold its breath. I felt the part of my consciousness connected to the core withdraw, dissolving into emptiness. In that moment, I saw the memory the myriads had implanted in us also disappear, not instantly, but gradually, like smoke carried by the wind. And in that disappearance, there was a strange relief. The consciousness of humanity was ours again, alive, imperfect, with the right to make mistakes and choose. I closed my eyes and felt a faint wave of light dissipate, leaving behind a quiet void, but not the void of fear, the void of freedom. When I opened my eyes, the tunnel was empty. The crystal no longer pulsed. Earth was breathing its own rhythm again, and I felt chaos return to the planet, the wind, the noise of the oceans, the voices of people. But this was our chaos, not managed from the outside. I understood that a part of me would always remember their light, their rhythm, and that the Mirids had left a permanent trace in us. But that trace was now merely a part of our experience, not a directive for action. Humanity had become itself again, imperfect, unpredictable, free. But somewhere deep inside, in the depths of memory, I felt a faint beat, like an echo of their presence. Perhaps one day we will hear that call again, and then the choice will have to be made anew. But for now, I stood there, on the border of Mars and the tunnel, and understood. We had preserved our right to be ourselves, and that right was stronger than any technology, any mind, any civilization. I took a step back, inhaled the cold Martian air, and for the first time in many months, I felt calm. Humanity had survived, but we would never be the same.